Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. I'm Dr. Mark Aldridge and I love Agatha Christie and write about her and talk about her and just love finding new things to say about her. Thankfully, helped by...
I was wondering where that was going then. The sardonic voice in the corner is Gray Robert Brown. Hi, writer and Christie disciple.
Nice.
This is the first episode we're recording since we have dropped, since we've actually launched the podcast officially into the ether, which is very exciting. How are you feeling about it?
Absolutely terrified.
No, it's been, everyone's been so lovely, haven't they? We should shout out and thank everyone for their support so far.
Yes. I love that people were interested in the same way that we were interested. Like almost something
yes.
Go, why has no one done this before? And not saying that lots of people have spoken about the 60s books, but to be focusing on it in the way that we are and hopefully digging down really deeply in lots of different areas. A number of people are saying, oh yes, those two interests of the 1960s and Agatha Christie, there's a really big crossover there.
Yeah. And this week, poisons, hallucinations, psychedelia. Whoa, man, this is rad. It's drugs.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
So basically, drugs were everywhere in the 60s. They were invented in the 60s like sex was. So there's some truth to this. So take a drink. I'm going to reference Sam Brooke. He talks about in 64, there was this Home Office report that observed that young people were in serious moral danger in terms of how easy it was to access things like heroin and hemp. It's difficult with hindsight to know quite how overstated this was. And I guess this goes back to our continual point that the 60s weren't swinging for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, this thing about the drugs being everywhere is also there's that point sums up both sides of that coin, which is in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of conversation. So it's like, drugs are everywhere because they're being spoken about a lot, as well as them being more available.
Absolutely, because there's this moral panic. And we've got, so the Home Office figures showed that the number of teenagers registered as heroin, cocaine or opium addicts tripled between 64 and 65. And by the late 60s, heroin addiction in Britain was growing at the fastest rate in the world. And this is in no small part due to economic growth and increasing consumerism that we spoke about in episode 3, in the money episode. But also we've just got a younger society. They're called boomers for a reason. There was a boom in population. Yeah. It's often said that the teenager is kind of invented in this time. Thanks to the improvement of international transport and communications, the potential market for chemical stimulants was bigger than ever, and dealers were able to supply it. The most obvious example in the early 60s was the popularity among the mods of Purple Hearts, which we may or may not come back to that. And by may or may not, I mean definitely will, which were perfectly legal until the government passed the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Act in 64. And then Sam Brooke continues, from 66 or so, amphetamines lost their fashionable cachet to the growing tide of cannabis and LSD. And pop culture reflects this, as you alluded to. We have increasingly just the imagery of people on substances permeating into art and music, and Christie books in the 60s are no exception to that.
Absolutely not. We'll go into some details about specifics later, but as a broad point, Agatha Christie is referring to drug use really casually throughout this decade. Like it's a part of society. It's something that she is just, reflecting in her books rather than necessarily railing against or making some big point about it. Again, it's something I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn about Agatha Christie.
Definitely. It's due perhaps in no small part to the fact that Christie famously knew her poisons / drugs, thanks to her work in both wars in dispensaries.
Yeah, I mean, Agatha Christie was very aware of the power of drugs, both for good and for ill. She, in her autobiography, tells a case of working with a pharmacist who would have a lump of curare in his pocket because it made him feel powerful. And curare being something that's, according to Agatha Christie, taken by the mouth, it does you no harm at all. Enter the bloodstream, it paralyzes and kills you. It's what they use for arrow poison. So she's obviously working in an environment where drugs are doing huge amounts of good, but was very aware that there are ways that drugs could also do great deals of harm. And that is something that's picked up in The Pale Horse.
The Pale Horse is a standalone novel that explores mysterious goings-on and unexplained deaths at a countryside inn from 1961.
This character sort of reappears. Pharmacist who likes the power trip, shall we say.
It's a really sinister story that she tells, and then she extrapolates that and uses that to great effect in The Pale Horse.
And people often cite this time that Agatha Christie spent working in the dispensary as one of the reasons for why she uses poison so much, and also why she gets their use so correct. You know, she's accurate in their use. And we will return to Catherine Harkup, who wrote the book A is for Arsenic, all about Agatha Christie's poisons. I have it literally next to me, ready to consult.
He's got for the listener, Mark's got his hand on it as if it's a Bible.
Because I am absolutely ready. Because, oh my goodness, the amount that I learned from that book.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It is so well researched, so engaging. So thank you so much, Catherine Harkup, for writing that, because I don't know where we would be in terms of our discussion without you. And in the 60s, she, again, in her everyday life, seems to be quite relaxed about the changing use of drugs for this sort of more recreational and self-medication coming up quite a lot as well. There are some really great interviews in the 1960s that Agatha Christie gave. One of my favourites is when she tells a story and says that people visiting her sometimes asked for tranquilizers. And she was like, oh, I just offer them an aspirin and say, will that do? But
I mean, really?
I know. Isn't that strange?
I if someone said that to me when coming around my house, I'd be worried about what that says about my company.
Yes, they're assuming. Well, they're obviously reading her book, thinking, "Hey, look, there's a reason why she knows her drugs so well."
Oh, that she can prescribe.
Well, prescribe, or that she has a little stash to try things out.
But also, maybe that's the reason you don't accept anything around Agatha Christie's house, because it's like there could be cyanide in anything.
Yeah.
You know?
So Agatha Christie's feelings about this increased drug use, again, for perhaps self-medication. She said, I feel all the young people are a bit worried. So many of them seem to take tranquilizers. I sometimes think I must be the only woman in England who has never had a tranquilizer. And this is what she said, young women come to my house and ask for them. That sounds a bit like people just wandering down the road and think, oh, that's Agatha Christie's house. I'll see if she's got any tranquilizers in. But I guess it's this thing about how casual its use was. Agatha Christie, famously amongst those who know her, didn't even drink alcohol. She liked to drink cream instead.
Yeah, that's the first. You know, when I met my boyfriend and we first spoke about Agatha Christie, that's pretty much the first fact, the first thing that he said. Most people are like, oh, and then there were none, or oh, Murder on the Orient Express, and he went, oh yes. Didn't she used to drink pints of cream?
Wow.
I don't know if he was trying to irritate me because he knows I'm vegan, but it was like that's top. Oh yeah, she didn't drink, she drank cream.
Yeah, what an interesting dinner party it would be with her with a pint of cream.
Well, I'm afraid
you just with your
no. If she comes around my house, she's getting almond milk, I'm afraid.
So she didn't even drink. She said in another interview in the 50s, no one can say that I drink like a fish, though I have rolled it round and round in my palate. I've never succeeded in liking it. And this led to us trying to work out whether Ariadne Oliver drinks.
Well, we had quite a long conversation about, because we found that she does have a sherry in Cards on the Table.
Yes.
But then we were like, well, I mean, is that the Christie equivalent of rolling it around her palate? Because I'd say if you had a sherry on a special occasion once or twice, that doesn't an alcoholic make.
No.
But then, or is that a continuity error? You know, we've said on the podcast before, and so many people cite that Ariadne is in many ways a cipher for Christie, and it would make sense that she would give that trait of hers to Ariadne as well, along with loads of other traits that she gives her. And we do have references in Third Girl to her not drinking, don't we?
Well, she says in Third Girl, I don't really like drink, which again is not the same as saying you don't drink. Like I would say, I don't particularly like tea, but if I'm in a situation, I know.
I thought you were going to say I don't really like drink, and I was going to go, Mark, I beg to differ.
But if I'm in a situation and someone offers me a cup of tea in the house or something, and I'll say yes and I'll drink it because it's fine, but I would never have it for myself. So that's not too different to being Ariadne Oliver. There's even other stuff that I noticed when going through various stuff at the archives, which interested me, where there's a letter about Death Beat. Death Beat is an unproduced jazz musical adaptation of Hickory Dickory Dock from around 1963. And she's offering some advice to the writer John Wells around 1963, sort of giving advice about, the difficulties of working in theatre as much as anything. But she does say, my advice to you two is to try to avoid pet pills and tranquilizers as long as you can. So she's saying, and get your agent on side and all of this. Oh yeah, and try to stay away from the pet pills, pepping you up, and tranquilizers just as long as you can. What a casual thing for someone in her 70s to say.
I like the idea that you could go onto like writer advice websites these days, and it would be like, yes, this is how you get an agent, this is how you write a good log line, and this is what to avoid in your personal life to keep your writing top.
Yeah, until you've got a hit show, don't take the pet pills.
Yeah, and then afterwards, do nothing but.
There are also, of course, some drugs that blur the boundary between being legal and not being legal and being used for different reasons. There's a thing about cocaine which pops up occasionally in Agatha Christie's works, things like Peril at End House in the early 1930s, that I think is really significant because cocaine particularly comes from sort of Sherlock Holmes, right? Sherlock Holmes famously used cocaine in between cases when he was bored to sort of keep himself stimulated and whatever. And so it feels to me like that's a particular drug that is an accepted part of the detective story canon because Sherlock Holmes is so sort of old. But most significantly, cocaine was only made illegal in 1920. And during the First World War, which is when Agatha Christie's working in Dispensary, people are able to go to Harrods and buy special packs to send out to our brave boys fighting for us in Europe. And they would include, if you wanted to buy the ones with cocaine in and a needle and chocolate and stuff like that. So it makes sense that although by the 1960s it's being seen, obviously it's illegal by that point and it's very recreational. When Agatha Christie was writing initially, actually, it was completely different.
In her formative years, yeah, absolutely. But also, it's funny, so a couple of people who I've spoken to about this project, when they've said sort of, what are you covering, coming up? And I've gone, we've got an episode on drugs. And the response is, God, Agatha Christie and drugs. And it's like, I mean, yeah. This is also the period in which new technologies, new advancements, and that means great leaps forward in terms of modern medical science. But that also just generally kind of leads to this increased public discourse about drugs, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting that the way that Agatha Christie's speaking about it, there isn't really a huge distinction between prescription drugs that may be being misused and illegal drugs. So, for example, we will come back to this in more detail, but in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side is a Miss Marple novel about a poisoning at a film star's house. It's from 1962. Calmo, which is a fictional drug, but the name tells us a lot about the sort of drug it's supposed to be, a Calmo drug. The way that it's described and used by people from America, it's pretty strongly indicated that it probably wouldn't be legal in the UK to prescribe or be unlikely to be prescribed as widely in the UK. We get this a few times, people saying, someone was prescribed this by a doctor in America.
Yeah, there's the elderly Aunt Ada, Tommy's aunt, in By the Pricking of My Thumbs. By the pricking of my thumbs sees Tommy and Tuppence return to investigate a mystery at a nursing home from 1968. Who goes on a bit of a rant about modern medical science, or specifically, as you say, the keenness to prescribe. And she says, everyone seems to be dying. No stamina, that's what's the matter with them. Weak heart, coronary thrombosis, high blood pressure, chronic bronchitis, rheumatoid arthritis, all the rest of it. Feeble folk, all of them. That's how the doctors make their living, giving them boxes and boxes and bottles of tablets. Yellow tablets, pink tablets, green tablets, even black tablets. I shouldn't be surprised. Ugh. Brimstone and treacle they used to use in my grandmother's day. I bet that was as good as anything. With the choice of getting well or having brimstone and treacle to drink, you chose getting well every time. And I think there are a couple of really interesting things about this particular extract. One is that in talking about the different colour of the tablets, Christie is explicitly linking us to the various coloured drugs that we will be talking about. See also the aforementioned Purple Hearts. And how they became sort of colloquially known on the street as by their appearance. So again, we have this blurring of lines between what's prescription, what's prescribed, and what's illegal. But also, as with so many of these examples that we've highlighted so far on the podcast, this almost is setting up the point that Christie comes to in the conclusion, which is that overly prescribed drugs can be dangerous because... What does Mrs. Lancaster use?
Well, yeah, she uses a stash of prescription drugs. So it's morphia, as they say. So Tuppence asks Mrs. Lancaster, how did you get it? Mrs. Lancaster said, oh, that was easy. A man I lived with years ago, he had cancer. The doctor gave me supplies for him to keep in my charge, other drugs too. I said later that they'd all been thrown away, but I kept them. And other drugs and sedatives too. I thought they might come in useful someday. And they did. I never take anything of the kind myself. I don't believe in it.
But she believes in giving them to other people because she kills...
Yeah, she kills Mrs. Moody at the care home, one of the other residents, and tries to kill Tuppence with them. And it seems like she's still got plenty.
Yeah.
From the sounds like she could have had a really big spree from that. But also, it's funny that Mrs. Lancaster, being sort of not terribly trustful of maybe doctors and stuff, Miss Marple says that, I mean, decades earlier that she doesn't trust doctors, but she doesn't go on a killing spree, as far as we're aware.
Well, maybe she does.
The Dark Marple.
If Catherine Brobeck's Dark Marple theory is anything
possible.
To go by.
Yeah,
there you go. I think it's a neat reminder that although we're going to go on to talk about a lot of illegal drugs, that there is another side to what Christie's depicting in this particular theme. We're going to throw the spotlight onto the fictional poisons that Christie invokes. Christie famously was very accurate with the poisons she used throughout her career, and the only time that she invents them are in the 60s books, which is particularly interesting for us. So one thing, I just want to, before we get into it, point out a couple of things about this. One is that 2 of the 3 are in Miss Marple books, which is interesting. None of them are in Poirot books. I don't know if Christie didn't feel like she could get one over on Poirot in that way.
Yes.
But also, I think in like Christie fan circles, I think there's a temptation to read the fact that Christie invented 3 poisons late in her career as a sign that she is failing later on in her writing, or that she cares less, or that she cares less about, or her grip on reality is somehow lessened or less successful. And I think one of the things I'd like us to do in this section is to really break down the merits of this approach and why it actually makes a lot of sense for these books. So first up, from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, we have Calmo, as you mentioned before. So we're introduced to it by Inspector Cornish. He says, it's sold under the trade name of Calmo. Ever come across it?
And we get a sense from Dr. Gilchrist, who is the doctor to Marina, who's our film star living the edge of St. Mary Mead, of how the drug works. Marina lives on it pretty well, so does everyone else around here. Ella Zelensky, who is secretary to Jason, Marina's husband, takes it. Hayley Preston, who we've mentioned before, is the willowy assistant. It's the fashion at this moment.
Yeah, there is definitely the sense that in this starry house outside the village, the corridors of the house are kind of swimming with Hollywood starry people, and they're all hopped up on this drug.
Yeah, but it's like this one at the moment, because he says, the doctor goes on to say, people get tired of one and then they try a new one that comes out and they think it's wonderful, and then it makes all the difference. So this sort of treadmill of new drugs coming along, whether prescription or recreational or whatever, and that suddenly they're going to be the miracle drug that will make everything feel great for everybody.
Yeah, so Gilchrist goes on to describe the effect of Calmo. So funnily enough, it calms you, or it peps you up. It makes you feel that you could do things which otherwise you might fancy you couldn't. They're not dangerous taken properly, he says. They help people who can't help themselves. Cornish says, it induces, or so I understand, a happy and tranquil state of mind. It's prescribed for those under strain, suffering anxiety, depression, melancholy, sleeplessness, and a good many other things. God, where can I get some?
Yeah, so everything, no matter what your problem, Calmo's going to fix it.
The properly prescribed dose is not dangerous, but overdoses are not to be advised. It doesn't sound dissimilar to a lot of anti-anxiety and antidepressant type drugs that are on the market currently. And Harkup makes the point that it's very similar to a lot of barbiturates. And this is kind of what I alluded to before. I think Christie gets some stick about this, but Calmo is quite clearly the brand name. I think All About Agatha said this. Mm-hmm. Calmo is quite clearly the brand name. It's not like the chemical name.
No.
And so I don't think Christie is inventing like a scientific product. I think there are plenty of things on the market right now that do this. It's just she's inventing the company name essentially, although, you know, the modern kind of consumerist name, which is very swinging, but also I think makes the invention seem less contrived than maybe criticism has had it seen before.
The one point that keeps being reinforced is about dosage, and it's almost as if Christie's saying it's not the drug's fault, it's that it's being misused. And
that's true.
You know, at the correct dosage, this is what it does, but this is not the correct dosage, and somebody's taken or forced you to take 6 times what it should be.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. I think as well, you know, this is the drug that is the preserve of the American kind of cool gang, which then ends up being the weapon that kills the woman from the development, the woman from it, you know, the English woman who's very much separate from that starry world in which the drug has been. There's a lot of contrasting that Christie's doing in that, I think.
And our next fictional drug.
Up next,
we're in the Caribbean mystery, where we find Serenite. A Caribbean Mystery is a Miss Marple novel about a murder on the fictional island of Saint Honoré from 1964. Which, as Harkup says, is a pure Christie invention. But again, we can understand what the drug's functions are.
I think so.
It's like, it's not, if you were to tell me that Serenite were a real drug, again, or maybe a real brand of drugs, I would absolutely believe it because it's actually quite straightforward.
Yeah, it's also a very plausible name. It does feel like all of these names are very good, I think, just as on an artistic level, the creation of a believable sounding name.
Yeah, it's found in the room of Major Palgrave, who dies. And there has been a sort of whispering campaign to make it seem like he had high blood pressure, and therefore there's perhaps an accidental overdose or something's happened from him taking his Serenite to control this high blood pressure. In actual fact, he didn't take Serenite, and people have been making up the idea, or a person, the villain, the culprit, has been using it as a way to cover up murder, to make it seem like it might be an accidental overdose or side effect or whatever from having taken his blood pressure medication, which he didn't need. Yeah. And this is a really important clue. So it doesn't matter really what the name is. The point is that almost anything that's strong enough that's prescribed in an overdose situation is likely to affect you very badly, maybe kill you, especially if it's a powerful drug. And this is where Victoria, who's the maid, picks up on this as a vital clue. And so, because of course she has been looking in the bathroom where she's been cleaning every day, and she knows that there isn't usually Serenite there.
And that's the reason she's ultimately killed, because she's onto that thread.
Yes.
And what's interesting as well in Christie's defence is that Victoria and the third victim in the book, Lucky, are not killed using Serenite. It is only Palgrave who is killed using this drug, which I think again helps to just kind of put a bit of context into this thing of, oh, Christie just invented loads of drugs and used it as a kind of easy shortcut to bumping loads of people off. No, actually, there's more nuance than that. And as an aside, in the same book, we've got Molly taking an overdose of sleeping tablets, which were, again, given to her by a doctor in New York, at least according to Tim Kendall, who, as we know, is...
Yes, it might not even
maybe
be
not to be
true,
trusted.
yes.
No, exactly, yeah. But the local doctor on the island, Dr. Graham, no relation.
Oh my God, that's so stupid.
Oh God, it's been a long day.
It is 1:48 p.m.
Yeah, but I travelled here. I'm exhausted.
You're exhausting.
I think I'm getting a bit of a reputation on this podcast for saying, well, that's not necessarily a Christie mouthpiece. That's not necessarily Christie's opinion. I think this is one of the rare instances where it is a character speaking out of character, and it's clearly just because Christie has a bone to pick. Because Dr. Graham says, I know all we medicos hand these things out freely nowadays. Nobody tells young women who can't sleep to count sheep or get up and eat a biscuit or write a couple of letters and then go back to bed. Instant remedies, that's what people demand nowadays. Sometimes I think it's a pity we give them to them. You've got to learn to put up with things in life. All very well to stuff a comforter in a baby's mouth to stop it crying. Can't go on doing that all a person's life. I don't imagine that a doctor who's on the front line of dealing out prescriptions would self-consciously be saying, we doctors do this wrong. Yeah, I think that does sound like Christie's opinion. But it's interesting that the preoccupation is resurfacing yet again in this book in the form of 2 different types of drugs. And then I think actually possibly most fascinatingly, and it gets wrongly derided, and I really believe it shouldn't, is Benvo in Passenger to Frankfurt. Passenger to Frankfurt is a standalone espionage thriller about Sir Stafford Nye's hunt for answers from 1970. Which we initially were introduced to it by its code name, which is Project B. And it is essentially this new miracle wonder drug. But in the words of Professor Shoreham, who invented it, it's not merely medical. And the idea is that it could be harnessed and used as a sort of mass weapon, but as a kind of utopian. It's this idea that it could be distributed to create great change. All of this, very Cold War. That chapter ends with the sentence, Benvo stood for benevolence. It's quite a striking moment of the book because we're initially introduced to this mysterious substance or thing, and I guess you fear the worst, but it's also kind of creepy that it's, is it really benevolent? Yeah. Is it benign? It's kind of...
We hear from Miss Newman, who is the secretary to Professor Shoreham. There is a vagueness to some of Passenger to Frankfurt, but here is where it really states its claim. So she says it came into the heads of scientists that one can change not only men's principal reactions and feeling, but also mental characteristics. The qualities of an aphrodisiac are well known. They lead to a condition of sexual desire. There are various drugs or gases or glandular operations. Any of these things can lead to a change in your mental vigour. Increased energy as by alterations to the thyroid gland, and a person may be in a state of homicidal fury. He may be pathologically violent, and yet, by the influence of Project Benvo, he turns into something, or rather someone, quite different. He comes, there is only one word for it, benevolent. He wishes to benefit others. He exudes kindness. Benvo can be released over a big area. It can affect hundreds, thousands of people if manufactured in big enough quantities and if distributed successfully. And then we're told that it is permanent and it could be used as a deterrent to be used in war or against mass uprisings, revolutions, which, protests and stuff rising. We know that is a thing that Christie's got a bit of a bee in her bonnet about in the 1960s. She goes on to say, it does not produce happiness in the subject, only a great wish for others to be happy, to make them comfortable, happy, in good health.
It's fascinating. Yeah. There's such a, because it really is that mixture of, it's kind of dystopian. There's a really concerning, dangerous aspect to it, but then there's also a utopian sense to it as well, that nobody's going to object to the idea of just everyone being happy and better, and it's certainly better than the alternative weapons that Christie is seeing developed at this time. We're told also by Miss Newman a bit about where it came from. So there was this fear from Professor Shoreham of what science has done in its time of triumph, the wonder drugs that have not always been wonder drugs, the things it has found out and known, the things that it has discovered and given to the world. He has been afraid of what science could do used indiscriminately. And this is exactly, it's the just because they could doesn't mean they should. It's the Oppenheimer principle to be kind of relevant, particularly right now, to it. But then there is also this slight kind of hippie sense of, I was put in mind of What the World Needs Now, the song What the World Needs Now, or like the Coke ad, I'd like to buy the world a Coke. Yeah. There is this peace and harmony emphasis that is so bang on trend from Christie right here in a book published in 1970. I also just wanted to quickly pick up on this mention of wonder drugs and being skeptical, healthily skeptical of them. I think one of the things that's in the milieu at this time that Christie is potentially referring to is thalidomide, which was a prescribed drug initially developed in the late 50s, but around, particularly in Britain, in the early 60s. And it was prescribed for pregnant women for morning sickness, and it was found to be impeding the health of the mother and baby, and actually led to babies being born with physical disabilities, and taken off the market in the early 60s. But I think that led to a greater sense of suspicion of these perceived miracle solutions that seem to just kind of come out of nowhere, which Christie's, knowingly or not, tapping into. And with the help of our friend Harkup, we're going to do a rundown of the poisons in the Swinging texts. So in Pale Horse, we've got thallium, which we're going to talk about in more depth in a minute, because that's a really interesting one. In the Miracrat, besides Calmo, which we've already discussed, we have Ella Zelensky is actually poisoned with cyanide.
Yes, in her atomizer, which is supposed to have her hay fever medication, I think.
Right. And then in A Caribbean Mystery, besides Serenite, we have atropine, which is given to Molly through her cosmetics to make her hallucinate. Yes. And it's in the same family as belladonna, isn't it? So we'll come back to that when we talk about the psychedelic aesthetics of the 60s. Ooh.
Endless Night, we've got another horrible sort of substitution where Ellie's medication, which I think is sort of an antihistamine, but is replaced with cyanide, is put in it. It's interesting that when I was reading about cyanide in Harkup's book, she was saying about how it's obviously famous for its bitter almond smell, which is often used in detective fiction, but that actually apparently between 20 to 60% of people can't smell it.
Oh, interesting.
And I also think, could you recognise a bitter almond smell? I don't know that I know what it is.
No, I do very clearly, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I wasn't being sarcastic, genuinely.
Okay.
Yeah, can you not?
What's a bitter almond smell?
Well, it's like almonds, but bitter.
God, I don't even know. Okay, maybe that's just me.
Well, maybe you're one of the 20 to 60%.
Maybe I am.
You better not take a drink off me later. Ooh.
No, you'll wait until we finish recording.
That's true, yeah. I can't kill you on episode 6.
And then we've mentioned By the Pricking of My Thumbs, Mrs. Moody dying. Though it's interesting, there's a little thing about that because she's old, they might not have actually checked and just assumed that she died in her sleep. But for various reasons, the doctor decides that he is going to check and finds out that she has been murdered with morphia.
And then Passengers to Frankfurt, we get a mention of strychnine in a hypodermic needle in relation to Lord Altamount, which is neat, apart from anything else, because Christie's been using strychnine since the very beginning, hasn't she?
Yes.
It's in Mysterious Affair at Stars, the first novel. Yeah. And, similarly, morphine and cyanide she's been using throughout her career. So it is, we're not throwing the baby out with the bath water in these 60s books. We do get a lot of homages to drugs past, shall we say.
Some old favourites.
Yeah, trotted out.
Yes.
And then, so these aren't in Harkup because she looks primarily at the novels and short stories. But so Go Back for Murder, which is based on Five Little Pigs. We have Conine.
Yeah, which is the same as in the novel, because it's colourless, although it does have an unpleasant smell.
Is it almondy?
Well, I wouldn't know, because I don't even know what that smell might be.
Yep, and then in Murder, She Said, we have, again, same as the book, 450 from Paddington, we have food poisoning, arsenic in the curry, which is what kills Albert, one of the brothers.
Yes. There are other instances as well in those MGM films. In Murder Most Foul, one of the actors, George Rowton, is poisoned with arsenic. And in Murder Ahoy, right at the beginning, snuff. Again, it's this thing about this replacement of things that people are using, whether it's, antihistamines or whatever. But the snuff of one of the sort of trustees in the early meeting in Murder Ahoy is poisoned with strychnine. And then later on, the assistant matron is killed by poison on a mousetrap, which might well be curare, which again goes back to the mention in the autobiography of Agatha Christie's. Not that this is an Agatha Christie written project, but nevertheless, we must be very clear about that. But in the ether, perhaps, known as a very strong poison.
Yeah. I like how, you said that a lot of these poisonings in these kind of 60s case studies it's a substance being replaced by something that people are using. There is something really domestic and insidious about that, and actually scarier, because it's like, you think you're just using your inhaler or you're just doing an everyday thing, and actually what lies in wait for you is murder. It's really clever. And then there were none. We've got Mike Raven. We talked about him in the rock and roll episode.
Mike Raven and the Blackbirds.
Mike Raven and the Blackbirds, to give them their full title. Debut single, Why Must My Baby Do This to Me When We Could Be in Love. All the things I can't remember, but I
wow.
remember that. But he's poisoned by cyanide again in his drink. And again, we have the smell of almonds revealing it. And then Dahlia Lavi's character is killed with a syringe that sort of looms towards the camera,
I don't
doesn't
think
it?
we're ever told what's in it, but I guess they couldn't do
Something
a test
not good.
because, yes, it's a poison. And then in the Alphabet Murders, the doctor says how he injected Amanda, who's our perhaps antagonist, maybe murderer, with a so-called truth drug, which crystallized her obsession with the Alphabet Murders. Which, this truth drug is exactly the sort of thing that Agatha Christie doesn't do and wouldn't do. But actually, because Amanda turns out to be involved in the murders, it's likely that this truth drug is a bit of a red herring anyway.
Yeah, and as you've said, by the end of watching the Alphabet Murders, you're sort of beyond caring
I have
anyway.
So completely. I rewatched it for this the other day. Or that last 10 minutes. And I was like, oh, is this how it ends? And how many times? I must have seen that half a dozen times, that film.
Yeah,
because of various times I've had to talk about it.
It's
completely wipes itself from my brain every time I see it.
That's for the best, I think. So we're going to pull out Thallium in The Pale Horse as a bit of a case study.
Yeah, because Catherine Harcup points out the fact that thallium as a poison was so rare. Actually, it was very little known prior to publication of Pale Horse, very rarely tested for in post-mortems, and that also the first known case of murder by thallium poisoning occurred in 1962. So after The Pale Horse was published. So Agatha Christie's really paying attention here to potential ways that poisons can be used.
She's ahead of the curve.
She is ahead of the curve. I mean, what a thing to be a trendsetter for. I don't know that we particularly would want that. But it's been pointed out a few times that actually in subsequent years, real life cases have been spotted because people have read The Pale Horse, including a nurse in the 1970s who recognised thallium poisoning because she'd read The Pale Horse. There's the murder of Molly Young by Graham Frederick Young, who's her stepson, which famously was made into, I think, a film, The Young Poisoner's Handbooks. But that was thallium, and again, at least partially recognised because people understood more about thallium poisoning, because Agatha Christie is selling, hundreds of thousands of copies of this book that lots of people are reading and understanding. So,
I mean, it almost adds to this kind of spooky significance and the sinister atmosphere of the book beyond the book itself, that it seems to be wrapped up in all these real life horrors. And Carla Valentine in Murder Isn't Easy builds on Harcup's research about thallium by finding a few lesser known kind of details as well.
She does, and she points out that although Christie certainly is ahead of the curve, as we were saying, actually Ngaio Marsh, the New Zealand writer, one of the other queens of crime, she had included thallium poisoning in 1947 in her book Final Curtain. She also found earlier cases of thallium poisoning in Austria, so perhaps less known over here, thallium containing pesticide. And Carla then says that there was a spate of thallium poisoning in Australia in the 1950s, apparently.
Valentine says that the pesticide is called Zelio, which does sound like one of the made-up Christie drugs that we've just been talking about. Yeah. Another case study. It deserves to be pulled out all on its own because it's just so swinging and so high, actually, as a book, is Third Girl. Third Girl is a Poirot novel set in swinging London about a young woman who thinks she may have committed a murder from 1966.
Third Girl's a really interesting one because if you read it knowing it's the 1960s and think about the sort of topics we're discussing this week and elsewhere on the podcast, actually, as a switch-on reader, you should be able to work out really quickly what's going on, right? Because the symptoms of Norma, who has been drugged with hallucinogenic drugs, and there's sort of a cocktail of drugs that's sort of left not necessarily vague, but we don't know exactly what the impact has been of each of the drugs that she's been given unwittingly. But that actually you should be able to work it out because their symptoms are very, very clearly linked to these sorts of hallucinogenic drugs in particular. And yet, because you're reading an Agatha Christie that Poirot's investigating, I think that most people don't make that link and don't think.
It's true. That's such a good point. It's almost like a meta double bluff. And this is exactly the preconception about Christie that we're challenging with this whole project, isn't it? Is going, actually, no, maybe she's doing something very contemporary. But yeah, she's almost harnessing the prejudices of readers coming into an Agatha Christie to hide what's really going on. But like you say, if you read it with the context in mind, then it's very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's, yeah, I love, I mean, I think that, as you've alluded to, the question hanging over the entire book is, where is the murder? Did a murder happen? Ariadne Oliver says at one point, was Norma's mind really affected, or was it no more and no less than the truth? Like, it's really nebulous and confusing, kind of the options that we're given. And the fact that Poirot, quite far into the book, still can't find a murder and is confused is giving us that addled sense that Norma's feeling. It's giving the reader exactly what the protagonist is going through, which is really layered and clever. I think it's popular, again, maybe in certain circles of kind of Christie fandom, to claim that the vague nature of some of the effects of the drugs are exactly what Norma's taking, or some of the names of the drugs. We spent a while trying to work out if dream bombs were an established drug slang or if that's something Christie's invented. We know that Purple Hearts is very much factual, is very much something that existed. If that's just her being a bit woolly and a bit out of touch and not really knowing the lingo. And I really strongly feel that, I mean, dream bombs are a very plausible name for the sorts of, in terms of the slang that's around at the time, for the sorts of drugs that we're seeing. They were colloquially named after either the effect they had or the colour they were, hence purple, or, I've seen reference to green Christmas trees and blue. But I think it's just again a kind of plea for a bit of credit, actually, because I think Christie is not embarrassing herself in terms of this contemporary knowledge as people might think she is. I personally find the world of the Swinging 60s in Third Girl very plausible.
Because she does bring it back to the real side effects or the real effects of taking these drugs, because there's a whole conversation once it's revealed and once it's understood that these are drugs that are affecting her. It's not insanity, in quotation marks, that is driving Norma, which some characters or even Norma thinks might be at one point. Dr. Stillingfleet actually says at one point, when he's trying to explain what he thinks has happened to her, he says she's not an addict. There are no marks of injections. She didn't sniff snow. Someone or other was administering drugs to her without her knowledge. And he goes into some detail then. He reels off the effects that many of these recreational drugs can have. You can go, well, of course, that's exactly what Norma's been doing since page 1. And as I say, an astute reader actually has had every opportunity to work this out. So he says there are dozens of these things going about. So I granted that is slightly vague, but he is saying there can be confusion, loss of memory, aggression, bewilderment, or sheer fuzzleheadness, which is a great word. Someone who was clever with drugs played merry hell with that girl. Stimulants, sedatives, they all played their part in controlling her and showing her to herself as a completely different person. So these are all drugs, they're all effects of drugs that they're discussing here, that Dr. Stillingfleet is discussing here.
Yeah, I don't think there are dozens of these things going about is unreasonably vague either. I think that's just colloquial. I think that's fair. The sort of authentic dialogue that Christie often gives. But yeah, sniff snow. I mean, that's street slang, Agatha. Yeah. That's like authentic street slang. But yeah, you touched on there is this question, is she mad, that kind of hangs over. And we talked a bit about insanity in the horror episode, but that is a big part of what the book uses as a red herring, but also to add some extra tension and atmosphere, and that people think she's crazy. To which Poirot says, there are many different names for these things. Eh bien, then you are crazy, or you appear crazy, or you think that you are crazy, and you may be crazy. You are crazy, or maybe you're not crazy, or that kind of Poirot, like rattling off all these avenues. It kind of echoes the way the book is leading us down these various confusing avenues. And it does bring you into Norma as well, to how Norma's feeling. It's fascinating, but one of the main ways that you can quite easily track the arc of popular drug use through the 60s is actually through the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. It's through the music landscape.
Yeah.
We obviously talked a lot about the Beatles in our rock and roll episode, in episode 2. But yeah, it's really fascinating how go literally up and then down in many ways, and how so many of the references in the Christie swinging text can be mapped onto that arc. So we start in the early days on the uppers. So early on, the Beatles are seen very clean cut. In Never Had It So Good, Sandbrook says about how there was no market for a scandal involving the Beatles because the front pages were already full of far better scandals involving the Macmillan government. There's this idea of the Beatles are like sweet boys that you'd want your daughter to go out with. And of course, behind the scenes, they were all taking speed. A drug they would not have made it through the grueling Hamburg days without, says John Higgs. When you listen to the sheer energy of the almost proto-punk She Loves You, it is hard not to see their use of speed as an integral part of their breakthrough.
I'd never picked up on that. That had never crossed my mind.
Yeah, but then it's one of those things, once you read that, you can't unsee that now. We have all sorts of references to uppers in these Christie swinging texts. We have that fantastic Sniff Snow, a purple heart or two in the modern fashion, which is this Dexamyl stimulant, essentially, and the dream bombs, like we talked about, that kind of thing. Then we go to a section I'm calling Chill Out Man, or the Downers.
Yeah, so much of this relates to cannabis use, cannabis smoking. Steve Nicholson points out that in 1960, there were 235 cannabis convictions, 544 by 1964. And in 1970, there were 7,520. Now, convictions is not necessarily always a link to use, but I think that there are parallels on this chart.
Yeah, that's a huge rise.
Yeah. What's interesting is that Sandbrook quotes Jonathan Green saying that actually the use of cannabis was as much symbolic and gestural as purely self-indulgent. So in other words, it was sort of performative, perhaps, that it was showing you're the sort of person. It makes me think of like when you'd wear a leather jacket, or, you know, even those sort of modern rocker sort of stuff, that you're showing, oh, this is the type of person I am. And for this, it's sort of being a bit of an outsider.
Which is maybe one of the reasons why invoking that appeals to Christie, because, you know, with such an ensemble in her books to introduce, it helps to have a shorthand to go, they're a bit of a wrong 'un, they're a bit of an outsider, they're a bit of a rebel.
Yeah.
Which we get in Christmas Pudding and Third Girl.
No. And it's funny that characters, even sort of establishment characters or older characters, don't seem to be too concerned about it in these books. I guess they're mentioned really casually, like with a sort of glint in the eye, as if, well, that's just what young people do. There's a really lovely bit, a thing that made me laugh, at least, in The Mirror Cracks from Side to Side, where Mr. Sampson, who we're told is the oldest man in St. Mary Mead, might be 86 or 96, no one seems quite sure, says of the party that's going to be held at Gossington Hall, says, there'll be a lot of wickedness, I don't doubt. Naked men and women drinking and smoking what they call in the papers them reefers. Yes, said Mr. Sampson with enormous pleasure. There'll be a lot of wickedness. You know, people don't stop finding things fun just because you get old. You might not be part of that set that's doing it, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily disapprove of young people doing what young people are doing.
I think, again, both Christie and the fictional Mr. Sampson deserve kudos for the slang reefers. I mean, that's what people were calling them.
Yeah, reefers pops up again in Third Girl, our perennial favourite for this episode.
Every episode.
Well, every episode. But yes.
So good.
Where Norma is asked but denies, do you smoke? Reefers, something of that kind. This is, again, by an establishment figure, people trying to work out what might be going on with her. So, yeah, very casual. No sort of, I'll call the police. But just, is this the sort of thing that maybe a girl like you might be doing? One person who's not necessarily disapproving, but certainly less interested in this sort of drug use is Miss Marple in A Caribbean Mystery, where Major Palgrave is boring her with various cases of other murders. And Miss Marple remembers one case that we are told was definitely not her cup of tea, because in this murder case, everyone seemed to have been drunk and there was a fine scattering of dope addicts. Not really interesting people, thought Miss Marple. So again, it's not that Miss Marple thinks, oh, lock them all up. But she's thinking, oh, that's boring, that it's being cornered. Maybe she's been cornered at a party by someone going, oh, that's really fun for you, but not so much for me.
Yeah, but of course as well, it's relevant to the plot that both we as readers and Miss Marple find Palgrave boring, because we're trying to bury what's actually happening, which is Palgrave's about to put us on red alert for the plot that's about to kick into motion, isn't he? So yeah, it is very cleverly used. I think we mentioned before in Passenger to Frankfurt, Stafford is drugged at the airport. He's given what is later described as good, reliable stuff, that dope. He says it put you out and it didn't produce any particularly bad effects. And Stafford just complains that it gave him a very nasty hangover. And Nicholson pulls out this case of this American play called The Connection, which I hadn't heard before, staged by the New York's Living Theatre. It came to London in the early 60s, 61. And Nicholson says that this play centred on a group of heroin addicts waiting for their next fix, a sort of Waiting for Godot, in which Godot is both dealer and the drug. The intention was to make it as lifelike as possible, to the point where you're not really sure what you're watching. And there was a lot of scandal about this being staged in London. So heroin is definitely something that we're seeing in the press at this time. And there's a mention in Third Girl. It comes alongside a list of the other drugs that young people are taking, like Purple Hearts and Coke. And hemp is referred to as well. Dr. Stillingfleet, again, he's talking about the effect it's having on Norma. Mm-hmm. Hemp distorts the time factor so that she might believe an experience has lasted an hour instead of a few minutes. So again, insightful knowledge of what that feels like, what the effect of that is.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff in Third Girl, a discussion about the after effects of drug use, where Frances, who absolutely is open about her drug use, if we can trust everything that she's saying, because she says that she's gone to Basil's party, this is part of the arty set, and Basil would try to make us try some new pills, Emerald Dreams. And then when Claudia, who's one of her flatmates, says perhaps that's not a great idea, Frances says, you're such a conventional type. Frances then clarifies, I'm not a drug fiend, dear. I just like to see what these things are like. And some of the gang are all right. And I think that's quite a natural bit of dialogue. I think that is absolutely the sort of thing
I agree.
that flatmates in the 60s may well discuss a night after a heavy night, whatever it is they've been doing.
And also, lest we again equate kind of Christie's opinions to any one particular character, the fact that the titular three girls do represent different facets of youth culture at the time. They're not a homogenous and negative stereotype. They are very different.
And although drug use absolutely can be used to indicate some sort of villainy, or that sometimes the murderers do use it during the 60s, as we've already discussed, it also is a really good distraction. The fear of it can be used to point the reader in a different direction.
Yeah, so we've been up, we've been down, and then towards the end of the 60s, we go sideways, and this is LSD. So Sandbrook, again, the use of LSD seems to have been much less common than other drugs that we were talking about, like cannabis, although accurate figures are even harder to establish than the others. So it did also have subversive associations as well as an artistic cachet. Embarking on an acid trip was a way of proclaiming one's emancipation from the mundane world of mortgages, Margate and Mary Whitehouse, he says. And here again, we can use the Beatles to track this arc. So in White Heat, Sandbrook writes, on the 24th of August 1967, the four members of the Beatles pushed their way through the crowds into the Park Lane Hilton for a most unusual lecture. The speaker, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a self-professed Indian holy man with a grey beard, long robes and bunches of flowers. He had studied transcendental meditation for 13 years in the Himalayas, and thanks to a highly developed public relations operation, already had some 250 worldwide meditation centres and 10,000 British converts. Yeah. None of his followers, however, were as famous as the Beatles. After the Hilton lecture, they were granted a brief audience with the great man. You have created a magic wand in your name, he told them. Wave it. And they very much take this advice. We do move into this period of the Beatles that's incredibly trippy and utopian and dreamlike. Picking up the story in Love and Let Die, Higgs writes about the interview with David Frost, during which Lennon and Harrison offered an enthusiastic explanation of what meditation is and why they'd taken up the practice. So there's this link as well in the British media of the Beatles' spiritual ideas and then drug taking to reach some kind of higher plane. Although, of course, the British have long colonized India, and these ideas have been in the milieu from that, kind of spiritually trying to reach a higher plane, either through practice inspired by various forms of kind of Indian spiritualism, or by the use of narcotics, or both, or neither. It's all swirling at this time.
Yes, so and Agatha Christie referenced this earlier in the decade, so pre-Beatles, where Rhoda, Mark Easterbrook's cousin, who's our protagonist, says to Sybil, who's one of our potential witches, "What a lovely coloured sari you're wearing." And Sybil brightens and says, "Yes, I got it when I was in India. I had an interesting time there. I explored yoga, and all that." So here we are, years before the Beatles go and help to popularise a lot of Indian spiritualism and Indian approaches to life and things like meditation. We've got our sari and the pale horse.
And I think now might be a good moment to say as well that in the British press at this time, there is this association with certain forms of drug taking and the increasing immigrant population, and that link being exaggerated and whipped up into a bit of a culture war is one of the things that we will touch on in our next episode, which is all about racial inequality in Britain, the empire, the increasing globalization, etc.
Ian MacDonald said that taking LSD in such large doses was akin to gambling with sanity itself, because it was impossible to predict its impact on the brain, which might include beautiful visions, pleasantly dotty distortions of normal perception, but also paranoia, hellish hallucinations, even mental annihilation.
And dare I say that is the way that some people feel about reading the experience of reading Passengers Frankfurt. It's all in there. I do think there is part of Christie poring over these newspapers that's probably absolutely fascinated about the way that people seem to be experiencing this stuff. And you can't escape it at this period. There's the Beatles' White Album in November 1968. Again, this is Higgs. The sort of sheer white cover, and this idea that it represented the state of transcendence that the band were experiencing. And it's especially striking when compared with the wild psychedelic colours and intricate detail of their previous album, Sgt. Pepper. And it did put me in mind of, you were talking about Lady Selena before, and it did put me in mind of, there's a bit after that quote where they're speculating as to whether Bess Sedgwick takes drugs at Bertram's hotel. And Marple, just almost as an aside, says, "One wonders if she is happy." And it is, and I'm thinking Project Benvo as well. There is this awareness of this, all sort of reaching for something. We're all sort of trying to achieve this end of decade resolution feeling of where's history going next, and maybe not quite getting there. So this is the culmination of our rock and roll drugs arc through the 60s, because, and this feels like a bit of a watershed moment, they basically get busted, Rolling Stones, in their hedonistic, secluded country house where they're all doing God knows what. It's a really interesting watershed moment because they do actually end up prosecuted. And this is seen historically as at the moment where the licentiousness with drugs in the 60s screeches to a bit of a nasty halt, and it's almost like the establishment reasserts itself over. Some people see it as the establishment making a point by busting them, and others view them as part of the establishment because they're let off relatively unscathed. But the point being that, we've really seen across this one decade just how varied. I was quite keen going into this that we didn't just speak about drugs as one single concept entity. We're talking about all these different substances doing all these different things and actually permeating into society at different points as well.
Just before we move on from LSD, I did just want what a sentence, but just wanted to very quickly acknowledge a story we don't talk about a huge amount, which is the Harlequin Tea Set.
The Harlequin Tea Set is the final Mr. Quinn short story, first published in 1971, but likely written in the 1960s.
So Mr. Quinn was a character who Agatha Christie wrote about, as I say, mostly earlier in her career. We see him alongside Mr. Satterthwaite. So Mr. Satterthwaite's a very standard sort of normal person. And Mr. Quinn is not. He's like this ethereal presence. So when he arrives, it's almost like dreamlike and seems to have sort of Harlequin colours. And so that can mean that he sort of appears from nowhere, and it's often to help people solve a crime. So he doesn't actually do the solving himself. He makes people think about it in a way that can then work out what actually went on. So he's not a new creation, but it's really interesting that he's being brought back here decades after she last wrote a Mr. Quinn story. She always said that she wrote the stories when the feeling came to her. She didn't like to sort of churn out Mr. Quinn stories. So she clearly felt inspired to write this one.
More than 40 years after the last time she wrote a Mr. Quinn story.
I think so,
yeah.
But seen at this time, it suddenly feels much more trippy because there is a reference to possible drug taking in the book. One young character is asked whether he smokes, and he says, "I don't smoke cigarettes and I don't smoke pot either." But much more interesting in terms of this era is that when we see Mr. Quinn, it really seems like a trip now, because we're told that instead of a dark black silhouette, there is now a festoon of colours, red and blue and yellow. This whole thing about the colours and the sort of something coming into vision in this sort of unusual way, once you've got through the 60s and this very public discussion of the effects of especially hallucinogenic drugs, I think you do read that in a slightly different way.
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of our, I guess, our mission statement is to go, let's look at these stories again with the context at the forefront of your mind. And certainly, as you say, when you do that with Harlequin Tea Set, you do come up with something quite different. There's also mention of Daltonism in the short story, which is interesting because that's colourblindness, essentially. And so it's almost like there are these two poles of the story. There's this vibrant, almost trippy colour on one end, and then the idea of being completely without that on the other. Throughout the 60s works, we do have these little dream sequences or hallucinations or psychedelia, and it does feel really strikingly contemporary, those moments from Christie.
It does, and it's often used in a plot way to sort of keep the truth at bay a little bit, because you're never quite sure what you can trust. Obviously, in a Caribbean mystery, we've touched on the fact that Molly was poisoned, but this face cream that she's been given, which has belladonna in it, that apparently witches used to use to induce hallucinations. But Molly would have blackouts, times she couldn't account for, dreams of flying through the air. I mean, that is... But we even get it on a slightly lesser scale of when at Bertram's Hotel, the canon gets coshed. And we have aesthetics again linked to this idea of sort of psychedelia hallucinations, because stars exploded in a kind of Guy Fawkes display within his head. Now, he's not using drugs here, but it's sort of invoking that same imagery that we might
associate. It's that imagery that's in popular culture that Christie is almost borrowing, I think. And I'm sure we know as Christie fans there are many a reference to people getting coshed
Tommy
in the canon. R.I.P. Tommy, because he's been beaten over the head that many times that he must be dead by now. Even before he says, "Good gracious, was he seeing things? But who? How? He saw the appraised arm too late." It is very kind of, it's like you say, there's a deliberate confusion there, which plays into this checkerboard approach for the 60s vibe that we're getting. We've talked loads in previous episodes about the peacock in Third Girl and how at times it's not really clear. There is a really thick layer of metaphor over it. Are we talking about a person? Are we talking about a creature? It's very visual. And Sonia, Sir Roderick's assistant, says of Norma, "I think she is mad. She says odd things sometimes. She says things that are not there, people that are not there. I don't always remember what I've done," Norma says, "or where I've been. I lose an hour of time, 2 hours, and I can't remember." And then this kind of sinister image. "I was in a corridor once, a corridor outside a door, and I'd something in my hand. I don't know how I got it. She came walking along towards me, but when she got near me, her face changed. It wasn't her at all."
That's really horror.
It's nightmarish, isn't it? Yeah. And sort of reminded me, reading it back, of the nightmares that Christie talks about, the gunman.
The gunman, yeah.
The idea that someone that she thought it was her mum, but they turn around and it's actually a gunman. And there's a little moment that Poirot observes as well. Norma smoking a cigarette and just staring in front of her. She seemed to be lost in thought. "No," Poirot thought, "hardly that. There did not seem to be any thought there. She was lost in a kind of oblivion." So that's almost like the reverse angle of, we've been allowed into Norma's head to hear all this madness, trippiness, and then we zoom out of her and see what Poirot's seeing in that moment. Possibly my favourite chapter, scene, whatever you want to call it, in all of these swinging texts is the scene in which Dr. Stillingfleet and Norma sit down and talk, and it's so trippy. It's almost like a nightmare. He says off the bat, would you like a cup of tea, or would you prefer a Purple Heart or a tranquilizer? That's the kind of thing people of your age go in for. Done a bit yourself in that line, haven't you? And she actually says, no, not really. But it opens us to this world of, we don't quite trust what's going on in this scene. Are people under the influence? I'm not sure. And she says, you're not at all like my idea of a doctor. And I was reading it certainly going, is he not a real doctor? I don't know. Is he going to do something to her? Also, we've had a long history by this point of
don't trust a doctor.
Yeah, Christie doctor killers. Yeah, exactly. And he says, and again invoking this psychedelic imagery, you can, if you like, tell me how you see pink elephants walking out of the wall, how you think the trees are leaning out of their branches to wrap around and strangle you, how you think you know just when the devil looks out of people's eyes. Yeah, the whole, honestly, it's worth a reread, the whole chapter. And they basically come to the conclusion that she needs to be sent away to Kenway Court. It's a kind of convalescent nursing home where people go for rest cure. It's got no doctors or couches, and you won't be shut up there, I can promise you. And she does agree to go at the end. It's very bell jar. It's I mean, I was reading it going, where's he sending her? Is he can we trust him? And I think Christie knows exactly what she's doing. She knows what buttons she's pressing. We're talking about the aesthetics of psychedelia. One of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating, and I don't know if anyone's really said this before. I don't even know if I've said this to you before in our prep for this. But, you know, there's that diagram in Passenger to Frankfurt where they're talking about the sort of modes of power and the way ahead, I guess, for this.
Like a Venn diagram almost.
Yeah, representing the operations of this global evil conspiracy, neo-Nazi conspiracy. And within that, one of the sections, one of the ways in which they are going about world domination, essentially, is the letter D, which stands for drugs. It's the global drug running, which is part of their scheme. And it's we'll post a picture of it to our social media when this episode airs. So this is part of the plan. A network of suppliers run them from various depots and stockpiles, all kinds of drugs, from the more harmless varieties up to the true killers. But the point being, in a book that's all about exploring the youth movements, the student movements that are going on at that time, and the aesthetics of the late 60s, early 70s, is that diagram not flower power? It's the image is those kind of flower power designs, and that's all tangled up in the Sgt. Pepper's psychedelic aesthetics. And I can't imagine it's not deliberate that kind of illustration is you know, that's exactly what Christie's talking about in Passengers Frankfurt.
Well, while talking about Passenger to Frankfurt, I don't know if you agree with me. My feeling when reading it was that actually this was a point that there was a bit of a shift in the way that she considers drugs, because this casualness that I've been talking about and we've been talking about in other books, suddenly for me, it felt much more cynical and negative, and that drugs were seen in Passenger to Frankfurt as much more of a threat to society. She seems to be much more concerned. And obviously Benvo is not a real drug, but she talks about drugs constantly as a means to exert power. It marks a bit of a change in the way that she's thinking about the impact that drugs might have.
Maybe, yeah, it's nuanced, isn't it? Because I think there is also a very real sense that something like Benvo would be quite a boon for society, and I do think there is that Passengers to Frankfurt is just generally a bit of a darker and more cynical book. So, but yeah, it's I see what you mean. I think, but you know, as we've sort of shown by that, going through the decade using the crutch of the Beatles and the various drugs that were coming in and out of vogue, it is in all sorts of ways the end of the 60s is less a marker of time and more about what was seen as a time of freedom and licentiousness coming to a bit of an end as the 70s come in and everything's a bit rougher and harder.
And it's interesting that she talks about the impact of drugs in several different ways in Passenger to Frankfurt, because there's also mention of the cult of drugs has been deliberately advanced and fermented. Vast sums of money have been made that way. So we're actually told the drug racket is a means and an evil means of making money. So not just about using it, the impact of actual drug taking, but that it's a way to make a huge amount of money as well. So there's more than one level she's discussing it there.
It certainly feels like her perspective has widened out, and we're talking about the whole world here.
And then there's a really harsh critique of drugs, if we're to believe that this is Christie's own feelings, where we hear about the villain or one of the villains in this quite complicated book, and asked is she behind the drugs as well. And we're told yes, but only as a means of having people bent to her will. It's one way too of destroying people, the weak ones, the ones she thinks are no good, although they had once shown promise. She'd never take drugs herself, she's strong, but drugs destroy weak people more easily and naturally than anything else. Which is hell of a difference from just saying, oh, I took some Purple Hearts last night, and, the sort of casual discussion that we get in things like Third Girl.
There are definitely a variety of perspectives on drug taking that Christie's exhibiting, which I think is very contrary to what people might expect before rereading them or reading them. And I think it just kind of comes back to our central message. I said at the start of this podcast, I've long been fascinated by Christie's late style and this idea from certain quarters that she gets woollier and sillier. And I think one of the things, and I hope that this episode among others has shown, that often when she's being diverting or confusing or nebulous or uneven in tone or bringing us down various kind of avenues, as in something like Passenger to Frankfurt, as in something like Third Girl, actually there's a lot of conceptual intent there often. So next episode, we're widening our scope, actually. It's really interesting. We've gone from the micro, from one tiny little pill, to the macro, which is Christie on this huge scale, the whole world. We're taking in colonialism and globalization and far-flung travel. Episode 7 is Empire.
Do get in touch as ever. We love to hear from you. You can get hold of us lots of different ways. We're across social media at Christie_time, and that includes obviously X and Instagram. You can email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. Our website is christietime.com, and you can find us individually on X. Gray's at classic_Graham, and I'm at Dr. Mark Aldridge, and I'm also on Instagram with that same at.
And on our link tree on our social media, you can find links to Mark's books. So there's Agatha Christie on Screen, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world, and the forthcoming, very excitingly, Agatha Christie's Marple, expert on wickedness. It feels like, I don't know, it's such a great title. I feel like it really needs a punch when I say it. I feel I channel my my year 10 drama when I say it. But until next time, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, or did you listen? Was it just a fever dream? Who's to say? The Swinging Christies is a The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 20th of January 2024. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio, and our music is by Dar Golan.
Sure.
So maybe something like shaking.
No? Oh my God, I am, aren't I? No, so probably only temperature.
Coda.
Yeah, oh my God. I am shaking.
Oh no, have you... Is that...
Oh my God.
Was there something in your beer?
Is that bitter almond? I'd never know. And please use this in evidence. Gray isn't even joking.
But also we've just unwittingly revealed that it's 4:00 and you've got a beer and I've got a wine.
Look, we got halfway through the episode. It's a long day. So we're not going to put the music in for this. I'm just going to have you.
Yeah.
Can you do the record scratch there? Oh, very good, actually. Yes, it was.
Yeah, good. And that's with the sore throat as well.
That is with the sore throat. Maybe it's curing your sore throat.
I think it's making me a better podcast.
All this chatting is fucking right.
Okay.